He is the kingdom's miracle, the prince whose magic bends fate and wins impossible wars. To the people, he is a savior. To neighboring empires, a walking apocalypse. But behind the crown, Alan only has one wish: to leave this small country, live freely, and chase pleasures without duty. Armed with godlike spells and a restless heart, he must choose between saving a nation and saving himself. Can the strongest mage abandon the throne without burning everything he loves, or will freedom cost the world? Let's find out. The story began with the prince seeing a large number of tanks moving in their direction. His maid, Celia, asked him what those iron ingots were. He assumed they were the Federation's new weapons, grinning and saying they weren't just toys anymore. He gathered his energy and declared it was time to end this and return quickly. The prince reluctantly headed to the battlefield. It was a small country surrounded by 4 great powers, the Urmila kingdom. For 200 years, the kingdom was considered the weakest in the world. However, since a hero appeared on the front lines, the kingdom had not suffered a single defeat at the hands of the 4 great powers. This hero's name was the second prince of the Urmila kingdom, Alan Urmila. MC sat at the table in the castle, clutching his head, loudly declaring his desire to escape. He repeated the same thing over and over again. War, war, war. Clenching his fists in anger, he was tormented by the question: who had ever seen a prince sent straight to the front lines? The prince jumped up and started waving his arms and shouting, "What nonsense is this?" Celia supported him, saying that his highness was as energetic as ever. She asked curiously if he was tired of yelling all the time. The prince angrily replied, "Tired? Even if he was, so what?" He started shouting again about how he needed to get out of here as soon as possible. Celia said in surprise, "But isn't that wonderful?" He was now a hero who had brought them victory in so many battles. She added that thanks to the prince's success, even she, a mere maid, could be so cocky. To which the prince reproachfully replied, "Isn't the fact that Celia became the prince's personal maid a reason to be proud?" Holding her head, Celia replied, "Even if she were the maid of a loser prince." But she didn't finish the sentence and changed the subject, asking the prince to be calm. The prince approached her almost point blank, his expression wild and pointed at himself. He said that all the members of the royal family respected him. But what good did it do him when he was literally risking his life on the front lines? Celia smiled and said that they simply loved him dearly. Celia's expression changed dramatically, and she suggested getting back to the matter at hand. She asked the prince why he disliked being an army commander so much. The prince countered by asking, would Celia enjoy going to a place that could endanger her life? The prince remarked that he wasn't some old man who valued honor and military exploits. Celia looked at him sadly. The prince continued, clarifying that he needed something more meaningful than just a title. Celia asked him, puzzled, "Can you be more specific?" The prince grinned and stated that it was difficult for him to say. He turned abruptly and said loudly, "A woman," to which Celia immediately replied that if it was difficult for him to say, then next time he might not blurt out the answer right away. The prince continued the conversation and told her that instead of wasting time on wars, he could be doing more important things. He raised his finger and said with a smile that he had saved up a considerable sum of money and wanted to spend it all at home with the girls. Celia didn't quite understand and immediately began to strangle him. She twisted his arm and replied that no matter how gentle she was, she couldn't forgive him for such a statement. The prince responded by asking her to share her definition of gentleness right now. The prince stuttered, saying that he wanted to resign from his post, flee this country, and live in peace. The maid stood across from him, sadly listening. He asked discontentedly why he had to toil on the front lines, answering requests from ardent fans from other countries. Celia immediately replied that this wasn't really a war. The maid clarified that the little soldier ants were supposed to fight. The prince laid his head on the table and asked, why should he be with the ants then? Celia placed a sheet of paper on his desk and announced that she had news for the ant lord. He took it and began reading, stunned. According to reports, 5,000 Lazarus Federation soldiers had invaded their kingdom. The prince, without taking his eyes off the paper, asked if he would have to participate as well. Celia calmly replied that if he didn't go, their country would disappear from the map, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the existence of their kingdom depended on his majesty. The prince smiled broadly and insisted that his beautiful and talented maid would have to work on that. Celia rested her hands on the prince's desk and replied that she was simply a servant, and if the master ran away with his heels flashing, she would immediately follow him. The prince, embarrassed, confessed to her that he was glad, because his maid's love blocked his escape route. Celia smiled, looked him straight in the eye, and sheepishly said, well, sir, shall we fight? The prince became very angry, grabbed the sheets of paper containing the report from the table, and threw them above him, shouting, damn, loudly. A sheet of paper fell to the floor, stating, Operation, Defense of the Border of the Kingdom of Urmila. Meanwhile, in the Lazart Federation, preparations for war were already in full swing. Captain Luhul, cigar in hand, examined the blueprints for an operation to invade the border of the Kingdom of Urmila. The captain thought that this war couldn't be simpler. According to intelligence, there were only 500 soldiers stationed on their side of the border, and all of them them were focused on defending the front. The tank's barrel was raised and aimed at the kingdom's walls. In comparison, the forces of the Lazart Federation, the most technologically advanced of the great powers, included dozens of the latest combat vehicles and 5 infantry corps equipped with the latest weapons. A whole column of combat vehicles and soldiers lined up in front of the castle walls. Their combat power was incomparable, the result obvious. At this rate, they would finally humiliate this hero everyone was talking about. The captain, moving his pieces on the chessboard, remarked that playing such a board game by these rules was pure pleasure. He had no intention of completely conquering the kingdom. He simply needed to bring victory to the Federation, a victory that would be used as a springboard to break the stalemate with the other great nations. Lucial thought about finally becoming a member of the Blackcoats. Suddenly, a soldier ran into the captain's tent with an urgent message. The captain, smiling, asked, "What's wrong? Are they finished yet?" The messenger told the captain that their forces had been wiped out by just 2 of the kingdom's soldiers. Luhel looked at the soldier in bewilderment. What? His teacup fell to the floor at the news. The captain immediately headed to the battlefield with the messenger to confirm his words. Luhel was perplexed. This? A counterattack. The enemy is approaching. 500 meters away. The soldier asked the captain what his orders were. At that very moment, a tank exploded right in front of the commander. The captain bitterly uttered, "Retreat. At this rate, our army won't get anything." Luhel clenched his fists in anger. The messenger interrupted the captain. The soldier hadn't even imagined the captain had even considered such a thing. Luhel insisted that if they lost here, their names would be forever tainted by the shame of defeat to a weaker kingdom. The commander couldn't understand what they meant by being able to break through their elite units. What the hell? Luhel was angry. Through the cloud of smoke, he saw 2 silhouettes. The captain stood rooted to the spot. The heroes approached. Alan saw the captain and asked him a question. The prince had gone to so much trouble to come for the commander's head, and he wouldn't even greet him? Alan stood in front of the commander, and the servant stood behind him. Well? He'd come all this way just to answer the request of his dear fan. Doesn't the Federation have a simple concept of gratitude? Even a small country like his offers tea to guests. And what about them? Luhel glared at him. So this was the hero? The commander hadn't heard anything about the maid. But the commander still couldn't believe it. It couldn't be the 2 of them? Celia corrected Alan and informed him that, generally speaking, no one offers tea to enemies. And besides, the captain was already busy stuffing himself. MC looked at the servant in bewilderment, and Celia added, "Oh well, if they had tea, she would have offered something sweet too." The prince corrected her. He'd started talking about tea, but he hadn't planned on having tea parties with him. That's called army humor. Liukel watched their conversation and didn't intervene. The servant remarked that overworking can make you sick. He rudely replied that this was precisely why he'd asked her not to force him to come here, since he was a prince, and the least suited for overtime. The commander was furious, and so, to some petty kingdom, a soldier standing behind the commander called out to him with a trembling voice, "Captain?" Liukel pushed the soldiers forward and shouted at them, "Why are you standing there frozen? The enemy is right in front of you, the hero prince and his maid." Alan and his servants stared in confusion at his screaming face. The commander screamed, "They will cut off their heads, and victory is theirs." The heroes were surrounded by a company of soldiers with swords in hand. The captain shouted from behind them, "Attack!" Celia turned and muttered, "Oh, how dare they point swords at a lady? Didn't their parents raise them properly?" She swung her sword and raised her hand forward. The soldiers stood in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had happened. "What? Fog?" the servant whispered softly, freezing. At that very moment, all the soldiers began to freeze. One of them screamed in pain as his sword was coated in a thick layer of ice, along with his hand. At that very moment, Alan struck one of them, knocking off his cap. One of the soldiers tried to strike him from behind with his sword. Alan ducked and dodged the blow, surprised by how diligent the Federation ants were. His desire to return home had already reached its limit. MC Roundhouse kicked the soldier right in the jaw. MC clarified that he already wanted to have fun with the girls. "Come on, don't you know how it feels?" The soldiers continued to attack him. Liukel was dissatisfied. Just 2 people had caused their Federation so many problems. The tank driver informed the captain that preparations for the restart were complete. The commander said with a smile, "Excellent." The combat vehicle began moving toward Alan. "If we can't take them with numbers, we'll take them with quality." MC, breaking away from the fight, turned around and saw the large vehicle heading straight for him. The protagonist was surprised that this hunk of metal was still moving. Liukel screamed angrily and watched from the sidelines. "Crush him." The prince lowered his hand, and lightning began to spark from his finger. He pointed his finger at the tank, causing it to flip over with a roar. He said, "Dark blue, yellow, like a bullet." The tank landed loudly on its turret. The soldiers fled, and Lucial stood trembling, unsure of what would happen next. MC noticed this and pompously said, "Oh, desertion, right in the face of the enemy." He replied in surprise, "Are you that afraid of your older brother?" Celia remarked with a smile, "And yet they are so rude. How can you raise your voice to such a beautiful girl? They have no forgiveness." The prince looked disapprovingly at the servant and monotonously replied that she was right. The commander stood stone-faced and looked at them. He had only one thought in his head. He thought, so here he is, a man of only 18 who became the commander-in-chief of Vermilla. And what's more, his magic is so powerful that he can destroy a tank with a single blow, and this maid isn't much weaker than him? Liukel stood with wide eyes and beads of sweat on his face. thinking about how the Federation had underestimated them. Who would have thought this small country had two powerful mages? MC snorted in disapproval. Did he and the maid really have to walk all the way from the capital? He noted that he had more than enough physical activity without them. The commander shouted angrily, "Oh, you little impudent prince of a tiny country." The servant raised her hand with a smile and said incomprehensibly, "Did this pig just dare to mock her master?" The prince immediately began trying to stop her. Wait, if we kill him now, we won't later." The captain interrupted the prince. "And you, little brat, are you so desperate to win the prince's favor that you're even following him onto the battlefield?" Luchel pointed at the servant, about to say something. But at that very moment, an electric shock struck his body. The captain froze in place and fell to his knees. Alan approached him and said, "I don't know what excuse you Federations have come up with, but there are actually plenty of people on our side with homes they'd like to return to." The captain knelt and looked up at the prince, who towered over him. The servant watched the whole scene with pride. He added that their war was senseless and filled only with self-interest. He patted him on the head and, with a grin, shouted, "Let's get this over with already." A chessboard with pieces and a broken teacup lay on the ground. The field in front of the fortress wall was clear once again. MC came to the tavern with everyone else. He thanked them for a job well done. Even despite the enemy's overwhelming superiority, no one died and the war ended successfully. Alan stood in front of everyone and continued his speech. "I think it's because everyone was able to unite and act together. Thanks to this, Rumila was able to win today. That's why." He jumped on the table, raised a mug of beer over his head, and shouted, "Go home, have fun with the girls." The entire tavern raised their glasses to the prince. He added, "So let's drink to our army's victory." People shouted, "Yes, hooray!" But only Celia stood behind with a disgruntled expression. People sipping beer idolized them. Wow, they defended the fort together. An incredible counterattack on the enemy forces. The prince and servant smiled. He shouted, come on, drink, don't think about money." The prince clarified that no matter how much his brother and sister scolded him, he would simply ignore them. The tavern was bustling, as expected of our commander. "He's right, as always, Mr. Hero," someone shouted from the crowd. "Such generosity will definitely make him popular with the women." Alan tore off his uniform and held it above his head. A servant, holding a tray in her hands, asked the master to put on his uniform, to which he replied, "What's with all that whining, like an innocent maiden?" MC stood without his uniform and clutched his chin. He clarified that these days, kind and proactive girls are more popular than inexperienced ones. Celia kicked him before he could finish his sentence, sat on top of him, grabbed his legs, and placed them on her shoulders. The prince screamed that his legs were about to bend. Suddenly, Alan felt, but what is this? What is this softness he feels in his back? His eyes lit up and his mouth dropped open. He felt the elasticity of a young beauty. The crowd looked at them, perplexed. A cry erupted. "How is Mistress Celia feeling?" Someone shouted, "Commander, let's switch." Now the entire crowd's eyes were ablaze. "Why is this position so attractive?" Celia, holding the prince's legs, muttered that she felt uncomfortable. "Please stop." The servant pulled his legs harder, and the master shouted that the pain in his legs was worse than this sensation. Alan lay there writhing in pain. Suddenly, Senior Sergeant Smirnov entered the bar and laughed. "You're just like always, Commander, just to find yourself under a woman's backside." MC replied that even in this situation, one must find the positives. The sergeant, holding a mug of beer in his hand, laughingly said, "Your partner is a princess." The servant climbed off the prince and stepped back, and Alan threw on his uniform. Smirnov continued with a smile, "Yes, it seems the commander only obeys backsides. By the way, what's it like to feel the princess's backside?" The master, without thinking, replied, "Thank God for that, to put it mildly." A servant called out from behind him, "Hey." Celia twisted his leg and shouted that she was embarrassed and that they should stop. MC screamed in pain. The whole bar laughed. The sergeant supported the servant. "That's it, Mistress Celia." The princess looked at him sweetly, while the prince, his eyes wide, writhed in pain. This is the story of a weak kingdom, and its second prince, who is considered a hero but wants to leave, and how his name spread throughout the world against his will. Meanwhile, in the kingdom's capital, Rumila was in the prince's large castle. Roy Rumila reasoned with a smile. The attack was repelled. The enemy commander and other prisoners of war were now on their way. "I expected nothing less from you, Alan. Excellent work." The first prince sat in his chair thinking, while Alan and Celia counterattacked the enemy positions and captured the enemy commander. The sergeant and the others were defending the fort, a very typical strategy for them. At that very moment, the butler approached him and asked him to look at these papers. Roy Rumila sat at his desk, staring at the candle. So Alan and the boys had obtained the materials. Now there would be more work, he suggested, rolling his eyes. Although I suppose it's like cutting off a lizard's tail. Suddenly, a messenger entered the office with a tray containing an envelope and said, "I beg your pardon, Your Highness." Roy stood up from his chair and asked him, "What's the rush?" The messenger approached the prince and handed him the envelope. "That's what we're talking about." The prince opened the envelope, sat back in his chair, and began reading, unexpectedly. The servants stood and looked at him with fear in their eyes. The prince broke into a smile and said, "The first princess of the Fanlar's empire wishes to pay them a visit. I wonder what she's up to." Meanwhile, in the capital of the Fanlar's empire, the first princess stood in front of a large window, musing, "The hero of the kingdom. I wonder what he's like." Alan was at the bar at the time, shouting, Do I have to pay out of my pocket money? The servant answered the master as expected. The crowd shouted thanks to the commander for the treat. It was an ordinary sunny day in the Urmila kingdom. Captain Smirnov of the Urmila kingdom army was conducting a training session for the soldiers. Well done. Let's take a short break, the soldiers replied. Yes, the soldier said with a smile, so peacefully. The captain slung his sword over his shoulder and replied with a smile, that's only in our kingdom. Meanwhile, in the first prince's office, Prince Alan was shouting loudly at his brother. Brother, I beg you, let me leave the kingdom. First prince of the kingdom, Roy Urmila, replied with a smile, I don't think it'll work. Roy Urmila raised his eyebrows and forced a smile as he answered the prince. Although this was his dear brother's request, it would not be possible to fulfill it. MC leaned on the first prince's desk and said with a trembling voice, well, if that's not possible, then how about a compromise, a vacation of just 20 years? Roy smiled, folding his hands in front of him, and told his brother that if he agreed, their country would disappear from the map. The protagonist approached his brother face to face and asked forcefully if his older brother's heart didn't ache when he sent him into the thick of things. His brother, smiling, replied that his life was constantly threatened by assassins from other countries. So they're all in this boat together, right? Alan continued to yell at his brother, and he was okay with that. If that's what he really thought, then there was news for him. Today, under cover of night, he would leave this kingdom. What would he say to that? The first prince was taken aback by his brother and thanked him for informing him. The protagonist, with a smirk on his face, continued that if he took this matter seriously, he'd escape in no time. After all, he was a mage. Roy Urmila smiled and glanced at the servant. Everything would be fine after all. He'd asked Celia not to let him escape. Right? The princess smiled broadly and replied, yes, there was no way he could escape. She was a mage too, after all. Prince Alan, sobbing, thought with bitterness on his face, his escape route cut off. The princess turned to the protagonist and informed him that if he truly wanted to leave the country, she was ready to go with him. The prince smiled and turned his head toward the servant. So, Celia interrupted the prince and added, however, she was absolutely certain that wouldn't happen. The prince's smile faded. MC clutched his head and started screaming. Why was he born a prince? God had clearly made a mistake. Roy Urmila stood up and declared that, in that case, he owed thanks to God for bestowing such magical abilities on his brother. Alan, tearfully turning to the first prince, added that even so, he was very sad to have to send his younger brother off to war. MC moved away from the window and, gesturing wildly, continued his dialogue with his brother. Perhaps he could at least give him a pickup, since this was the case. Roy Urmila replied that he knew, as their financial situation always left much to be desired. He raised a finger, noting that he should be asking his sister, who was responsible for their treasury, not him. MC listened silently and looked at his brother. The protagonist immediately turned away, tears welling in his eyes, noting that at this rate, he wouldn't have enough money for beauties. The first prince looked at his brother pitifully and then replied, I think Celia won't forgive her brother for such words. Alan looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he allowed her. But before he could finish, a servant placed a hand on his shoulder and a wild cry rang out. The first prince smiled and said he needed to go. The protagonist, placing a hand on his shoulder, was dissatisfied with this exchange. The princess asked the first prince, confused, if he had any plans, to which Roy replied that he did. He needed to meet someone. The second prince looked at his brother and wondered who it could be, to which Roy, adjusting his frill, replied, he's in charge of external relations. As he left his office, he added that his guests were specifically for that purpose. Today they had guests from the great power, the first princess of the Famlar's empire. The first prince, walking down the corridor with a guard and his assistant, thought about how, ever since his brother became commander-in-chief, they had stopped constantly losing territory and had even begun receiving all sorts of things from countries as compensation for their aggression. The corners of the first prince's lips drooped, but something still nagged at him. As he thought, the Federation had decided to pay them off financially for the recent attack. But that didn't even come close to covering their expenses. If things continued like this, their country would never prosper. Roy walked down the corridor and, glancing out the window, thought that to change the situation, they would develop the kingdom, strengthen its defenses, and prevent invasions before they happened. Meanwhile, the captain was training in the castle courtyard. The second prince continued to stare out the window, thinking that if he did this, his brother would feel better too. The first prince, approaching the door with his assistant, remarked that the brother and sister were trying so hard. He continued that it was improper for the elder to remain on the sidelines. Meanwhile, MC was playing cards with his servant in his room. He threw his cards on the table and shouted, "How do you like that?" Princess Celia replied in surprise, "Wow, royal street flash." Alan asked again, "What? Is she cheating?" The servant, clutching her cheek, replied that she would never dare cheat against the master, as he would fire her immediately. At that very moment, the first prince entered their room asking, "Is Alan here?" The princess, distracted from her card game with Alan, turned around. Master Roy must have had something wrong. He was about to leave for a meeting. The queen appeared from behind the first prince. Oh, it was the very same hero of the kingdom. Celia looked at her in bewilderment. The Fanlar's Empire's queen stood in her beautiful dress. "Nice to meet you," she said, but before she she could finish, she saw the prince sitting in a chair, shackled and chained, his servant holding the chain. The first princess looked at them in confusion and wondered. Shackles? Roy Ermila stood behind her, smiling as he commented, "What a funny scene." Apparently, he didn't know everything about his younger brother's hobbies. Prince Alan started yelling at his brother, maybe he shouldn't barge in here without permission, and jumped to conclusions. He couldn't recall him being a great card player. Celia stood behind him watching the whole scene. MC, unfastening the shackles, glanced at the first princess. "So who is this beauty?" Looking down and forcing a smile, she introduced herself. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Hero," and Rise Van Lars. The protagonist extended his hand and reciprocated. Alan Ermila. MC moved closer to his brother and continued. "So what brought them to him?" His older brother handles everything related to international relations. The Imperials were always looking for a fight with him, so he could only respond in kind, kicks, and punches. The first princess smiled and remarked on the terrible things he was saying. She agreed that they were partly to blame, chuckling as she said she'd pretend she hadn't heard his remark. Roy Ermila stood behind his brother, smiling. The protagonist looked at his brother and remarked that he couldn't handle such a difficult task as entertaining the princess of an enemy country. The older brother looked at him and confirmed that he was right. This time, he wouldn't be enough alone. The conversation would spill over into his area of responsibility. The younger brother turned and ran screaming from the room. "I have to take my leave." Rise stood behind him next to his brother, confused as to what was happening. The maid holding the shackle watched him run away. Alan tried to escape but failed. His leg was shackled and he fell, hitting his head on the floor. The maid was surprised by how gracefully the master dove. MC snorted. He didn't do it because he wanted to. The first princess stood and watched. They all sat down at the table in the main hall. The maid brought a cart with tea. Rise asked, perplexed. "Really? Forcing a mage to work as a maid?" In their empire, mages were valued and given every possible privilege. The protagonist replied that it was exactly what she wanted. The first princess smiled and praised the maid. Usually, if a person is strong, they'll also be greedy. Roy Ermila looked at the maid with pride, noting that this loyalty was entirely directed at Alan. The servant smiled at the first princess and replied that it was because her master had saved her. Now she no longer thought about things like power or wealth. Riza grinned, explaining that it was a pity she'd thought recruiting a maid would be easier than the prince, but apparently it would be quicker to try to lure him away. The youngest prince responded with surprise. If she swears not to send him to the front lines, he'll seriously consider her offer. The prince and his maid looked at her deeply and listened. Rise remarked that this was difficult to accomplish, and after all, the only place a mage could exist was on a battlefield. Alan turned to his brother and, gesturing, continued the conversation. "Let's get down to business. Why did she say her visit was related to the war? Are they having another pointless skirmish at the border?" The elder brother answered, "Generally speaking." The first princess watched them and listened attentively. Roy noted that the children were fighting over a toy there, and it seemed other nations had gotten involved in this squabble. In other words, the problem wasn't about other countries, but about the Empire's internal affairs. Scarlet jumped up and forced out that in that case, he was leaving. Rise grabbed his arm, and the younger brother was taken aback. The prince and his servant looked at her in confusion. MC quietly asked her to let go, because if such a beauty was going to hug him, he would have no choice but to sit back down. Rise smiled and looked him in the eye. He was so honest, she even liked it. The protagonist barked loudly, "Don't be silly. If they interfere in their family affairs, they'll go to war." The princess placed a finger on his lips and replied, "Yes, he's definitely her type." The princess sat closer to Alan, and he suggested they listen to what else their brother has to say. "Go on." Celia clicked her tongue in disapproval. MC affirmed, "We're listening, Celia." Roy Ermila sat down on the sofa opposite and continued the conversation. So back to the topic at hand. Mrs. Rise had stopped by on her way to Lethia. The protagonist, perplexed, asked her why they were going there. "Isn't Lethia the country to the right of the magical land of Luzon?" The first princess began explaining that the empire was currently in the midst of a battle for the throne, and the second prince, eager to prove himself on the battlefield, had already attempted to invade their territory several times. The protagonist remembered him. "Oh, the one who was always yelling?" Rise lowered her eyes and apologized for her foolish brother's behavior. She herself had no plans to ascend the throne, and was even a member of the first prince's faction. MC glanced at her and confirmed. In other words, they were heading to Lethia to gather the first prince's allies. The princess turned to him, surprised, and asked how he'd figured it out so quickly. Alan, sipping hot tea, remarked how nice it was to receive praise at least once in a while. Roy interrupted their conversation and continued, finally getting to the main problem. It seemed the second prince had set his sights on Lady Rise and was planning an attack. Alan looked at him in confusion and asked where. The first prince answered, "Here." The first princess looked at her older brother and remarked, "So for starters, she wants to leave the kingdom." Alan, his eyes glittering, jumped up from the sofa and said, those were exactly the words he'd been waiting for. The protagonist reasoned in his head, If they were targeting Rise, the logical move would be to invade under the pretext of rescuing the princess. However, if Rise left the kingdom and the second prince's faction attacked anyway, they could demand substantial reparations for the illegal invasion if they won. Naturally, he'd want to avoid war, but if it's inevitable, he could get a small compensation for his efforts, he clarified. So he just needs to show up when the second prince's faction makes a move? The eldest prince raised his hand and stopped him. No, he'll have another task. Rise, holding a mug of tea, remarked that there most likely won't be a war in the kingdom. The maid, confused, asked what she meant. The princess replied that it was simple. Her destination was Lethia. The second prince should know about it too, and if she were attacked en route, it would be too obvious that she was their target. The brothers looked at her blankly. The princess continued to explain that the second prince wouldn't care even if she was killed. But people tend to take the easy way out, right? Alan drawled unpleasantly. I see. Roy Ermila noted that for his assistance in this matter, their kingdom demanded only one thing, a promise. No invasion by the Empire, ever. Rise calmly replied, after the first prince's ascension, of course. The eldest brother lowered his eyes, forced a smile, and said, in return, they will provide you with Alan. He wanted the prince to accompany the princess to Lethia. In other words, a battle called Escort awaits him. Except that, Alan looked at him sadly and said, the alternative is still less appealing. He'd be very happy to stop receiving dance invitations from the Empire. The princess looked at him, confused. Alan added indignantly, it's still unknown whether the first prince will ascend to the throne. Even if she returns home with souvenirs, how will he sleep given such a troubling uncertainty? The princess wanted to start telling her story, but the maid interrupted her and asked if she could say something. The princess asked what was wrong. The servant said fearfully, their actions put her own life at risk, even for the sake of the faction she supports. It's too reckless. Why would she do that? The princess interrupted her, looking her in the eye and saying it was a stupid question. She was the first princess of the Famlar's empire, and she wanted to minimize the wars and disasters that might affect the empire in the future. If she could guarantee the support of their Lethian allies, they could resolve this stupid dispute over the succession without shedding a drop of blood. The prince and his maid continued to stare at her in bewilderment. Rise, placing her hand on her chest, smiled and replied that she was willing to risk her life for this goal. The protagonist thought to himself that he would participate in this battle. He walked out into the kingdom's courtyard, approached the captain, and looked at him. Smirnov reported that the general had 500 guardsmen on full alert. Alan asked him in response, isn't that too many? The captain answered him with bewilderment, but Lord Roy ordered exactly that many, just in case. Behind the captain, the soldiers were quietly discussing something. After all, they still had Lady Rise's escort, the Empire's warriors. The captain approached Alan and whispered in his ear, ah, you see? The prince was very surprised. Roy came closer and called out to Alan. The master answered, what is a brother? Roy continued. He wanted to tell him one more thing before he left. The prince watched him intently, and behind him, the first princess was already boarding the carriage with her knight. The eldest brother smiled, waved, and told him to take care of himself. The first princess's carriage passed the kingdom's border. She sat and thought, her mind boggled. She recalled him screaming and shackled. According to rumors, he was an invincible hero, though that didn't sound very credible. She had somehow managed to secure the kingdom's support. All that remained was to reach Lethia. Rise rode silently in her carriage when a knight shouted from the window to the right, enemy. The princess calmly turned her head to the right and saw the battle. The knights fought and shouted, protect the princess. Don't let anyone even get near the carriage. Show them the kingdom's strength. The knight defended the princess, brandishing his sword. What does the kingdom have to do with this? Wipe the enemies targeting the beautiful lady from the face of the earth. Alan noticed, oh no, they're already here. It looks like they're completely surrounded. The maid stood with her back to the other heroes and said, Ms. Rise's predictions were spot on. Smirnov laughed. Today will be fun again. The prince, smiling, looked at her highness and asked, time to start an extreme picnic on the way to the anniversary, huh? After crossing the border, the princess's carriage was attacked. The knights fought off the soldiers. Alan, with his back to the maid, fought off other soldiers. The maid said, as soon as they left the kingdom, they immediately fell into an imperial ambush, a complete information leak. Confused, Alan asked, she means there's a traitor among them. The gentleman shouted toward the carriage, hey princess, didn't you say you imperials are bound by strong ties? Rise looked at him in bewilderment and replied, that can't be right. Just think about it. They would have had a dispute over the succession to the throne then. But he and his brother get along so well. She envies them. The second prince yelled at her that she shouldn't pour out her heart to him here, but should apologize instead. Oh, sorry for leaking the information. And don't forget to lower your gaze and focus on your chest. The princess looked at him blankly and replied, she would have done that, but MC thought he was in full view right now, clenched his fists, looked up and screamed loudly. Damn! The protagonist saw two knights approaching him from behind. He He glanced at them and released energy from his hand, sending them flying back. The first princess, surprised, quietly said, "Wow, here it is, the spell of the kingdom's hero." Spells are the pinnacle of magic. Each natural phenomenon corresponds to one of the attributes divided by color: red, blue, yellow, green, black, and white. Using mana to summon these phenomena is called magic. By mastering all possible spells of varying levels, a wizard can master magic accessible only to them. Only a few people in the entire world have reached this pinnacle. Alan's magic possessed the yellow attribute, lightning, having studied lightning as a natural phenomenon. Alan heroically fought off the knights, and he was able to create his own spell, electricity. The knights were scattered one after another by his lightning. A mage typically masters only one spell, but it has a wide range of capabilities. In his case, he can shock a person with a single touch, as well as send electricity at an enemy from a distance. The first princess, sitting in her carriage with a sad expression, thought, "Mages mostly fight by shooting from a distance, and since he's capable of close combat, he'll have an advantage even in a fight with other mages." The MC continued to fend off the knights. The captain laughed, raising his sword above his head and loudly exclaiming, "This is a battle. Come on. Don't be afraid. Come closer. The true joy of battle is fighting without hesitation." His face broke into a smile, and he delivered a slashing blow. The captain himself was at the forefront, easily swinging his enormous two-handed sword, cutting down enemies in his path. Despite the kingdom having two mages, one of the main reasons they continue to win wars is the existence of this man. The protagonist shouted loudly toward the carriage that he, of course, apologized to Her Highness. "But isn't this escort a bit too small?" Smirnov, delivering another blow with a smile on his face, loudly remarked, "That wasn't that wonderful, Commander? They'd only get more enemies." MC loudly and indignantly asked, "Why should they overwork and deal with the extra workload?" The princess, sitting in the carriage, said, "Idiot. If she'd brought an entire army, other nations might have thought she was going to war against them. So she had to take about 10 people. Alan continued yelling at her, while the captain fought off the enemies. "Is she really going on a picnic? Now he'll have to suffer because of it. She could at least pretend to be sorry. She doesn't understand the consequences of low morale. She won't do anything about it." The first princess thought in one breath. Rise leaned against the carriage window and said, "It seems she has no choice. Gentlemen, her dearest protectors." All the soldiers turned to look at her. The first princess raised her hand, smiled, and winked. "Please do your best." All the soldiers shouted and raised their swords up. After the princess's request, they were ready to fight to the death. They would personally slaughter all the imperial dogs who wanted to deprive the world of this smile. Dishonorable enemies, how dare they point a sword at a girl? Let's show them how beautiful and righteous the life of a man protecting a woman is. The protagonist was motivated by their speech. This is what he understands. His soldiers are his brothers in arms. The maid stood behind and added, "They're just as simple as the master himself, and yet there's no end in sight for them." The MC grew angry, clenched his fist, and asked the servant to take everyone back because he wanted to end this with one blow. Celia raised her hand and agreed with the master. "Yes, I obey." Huge hands appeared from behind her, grabbed all the soldiers and carried them back. The soldiers looked on in bewilderment. Smirnov didn't understand what was happening and shouted, "Princess?" She let go of him and he fell headfirst. Alan, surprised, asked her why she was treating a man among men like that. Celia smiled and told him that for her, only he was a man, sir. MC, gritting his teeth, said, "Well, fine, so be it." The knight stood in front of him, waiting to see what would happen next. The protagonist extended his hand to the right, clenched it into a fist, and lightning began to emerge from it. He remarked that it was not proper for a prince to engage in such things. The knights took cover behind their shields, and he extended his hand toward them, a large amount of energy pouring out of his hand. He loudly declared that if he couldn't handle this, he could no longer call himself a mage. All the knights standing in front of him were engulfed in lightning, dark blue and yellow, like a bullet. Rise, sitting in the carriage, watched this, thinking, there were mages in her homeland too, but could they stand up to him? MC stood with a huge cloud of dust in front of him. He said, "And yet, he still wants it." Alan sighed with relief and lowered his hands. Finally, there was silence. Celia stood behind him and thanked him for his excellent work. Alan thought that despite everything that was happening, Lady Rise remained surprisingly calm. As soon as they crossed the border, they were suddenly attacked. The servant added, "Maybe she expected this?" The captain, clutching his neck, ordered them to continue moving according to plan. "Let's hurry. The border of the country of magic. If they don't make it to the village, they'll have to abandon camp." The soldiers accepted the order. Yes, the first princess ordered them to set up camp. Tonight, they would spend the night outdoors. The protagonist and his servant looked at her in bewilderment. "Huh? Seriously?" The princess from the carriage replied that there was nothing to be done, since their original route was now known to the enemy. If they continued to follow the plan and stopped at the village, they would be attacked in the middle of the night. MC nervously replied that this was precisely why he hated war. He wanted to sleep on a soft pillow and was tired of walking. The princess, surprised, told him he could ride. Alan replied that horses were afraid of his magic, and besides, it was easier to react in the event of an attack if he was on his feet. The maid, holding shackles in her hands, told the prince not to worry about a place to sleep. She would prepare a comfortable pillow for him. Her legs. MC turned to her and grumbled that he preferred pillows without shackles and chains. He might not mind sleeping in the fresh air, but what about Lady Rise? He hated to talk about it, but would she really be able to sleep in their presence? The first princess calmly replied that it was true. They simply had similar interests, which meant they weren't allies. Everything in its own time. The prince and the maid looked at her, unsure what she meant. The princess continued, but if, instead of the second prince's plan succeeding, they killed her, it would be even easier for the first prince. In their time, even a corpse has value if it belongs to nobility. Alan and his servant walked next to the carriage. The princess remarked that everyone will die someday, since she was born a princess. Even her death will have some meaning. So don't worry. The maid looked at her with incomprehension. MC placed his hand on the carriage and told her not to say such sad things. Not to say that she was ready to die for some kind of meaning, and that her duties, goals, and views were admirable. But above all, she was a girl, and he valued not only her beauty, but also her right to find happiness. The princess was embarrassed, while the maid smiled and expressed pride. Otherwise, everyone who risked their lives for her, including himself, would be upset. Rise's eyes widened and she wondered, for her sake? Not for the good of the country, but for her own. Alan forced a smile and said he hated to say it, but she shouldn't worry. Only exemplary men were gathered here, ready to sacrifice themselves for a woman, so she could trust them with her back. The soldiers walking next to the carriage exchanged glances. The protagonist clarified that it concerned him, and he would certainly protect her. The first princess looked at him deeply. MC looked back and smiled. Someone was waiting for her return, right? Alan continued walking next to the carriage, saying that men were simple creatures and all they needed to be happy was to see a girl's smile. The princess looked out the carriage window and told Smirnoff that they would set up camp today. The captain indignantly asked why. So what if they let him sleep? He didn't care. Hey, everyone heard, yes. Rise turned to the maid. Listen. The servant smiled and asked attentively, what is this, mistress? The princess replied sheepishly, your master, he's lovely. Celia raised her hand to her cheek and replied, yes. It was not for nothing that she was proud of him. It was the dead of night, and smoke was billowing from the tents. The captain pointed at the map and said that the fastest way from here to Lethia would be through the land of magic. One of the soldiers remarked that if today's attack were repeated on foreign soil, they would be in serious trouble. The captain said the only way out was through the empty zone between the borders. The captain of the detachment accompanying the first princess watched and listened attentively. Smirnoff added, but if they were outside the territory of any country, the enemy could attack them at any moment. A joyful journey awaited them. The soldier looked at the commander-in-chief and asked, by the way, commander, who did this to you? A battered prince stood before them, his face bruised and his hair disheveled. Smirnoff added that the prince had tried to secure an invitation to bathe with the princess, and the consequences, as they say, were obvious. The soldiers asked where Lady Celia was. Smirnoff looked at them and replied that she had gone to bathe with the princess for safety. Soldier asked, both of them? They exchanged glances, and suddenly their mouths opened and their eyes lit up. Two beauties in a bathhouse together. We need to end this meeting immediately. Smirnoff thought they were perverts, and the captain of the escort squad said, how dare they? The first princess, stripping off her clothes, thanked the servant. Thank you, she said. After all, she would have been uneasy alone. The maid replied with a smile that she'd originally planned to stand nearby while she bathed. If she didn't mind, could she wash with her? Rise replied affirmatively, of course. The mistress smiled and said she'd been meaning to chat with the warrior girl and wanted to ask a few questions of her own. Celia, unfastening her stocking, asked, she, the prince's personal servant? Rise pulled her hair back into a bun and asked, is that really true? The servant lowered her eyes, unsure of what she was talking about. The mistress continued, adding that she had a very good memory and hadn't wanted to be rude to anyone in the castle, so she'd kept quiet, but she'd been very surprised to see her in the kingdom. Rise turned to her, holding a towel over her chest with her left hand. Don't you remember that boring party, full of flattery and evening gowns? The servant recalled a beautiful hall with large windows and luxurious chandeliers. A child prodigy of the Celestine counts from the land of magic, Celia Celestine. Monica ran up to her and wished her good morning. She reciprocated, saying that today would finally be the end of exams. Her friend expressed her concern about the final practical exam. She said she shouldn't worry and should just do the same as always. Monica replied that she knew this but was still nervous about it, and she said that if they passed the exam, they could have tea at their favorite place. Her friend was delighted, agreed, and said it was a promise. They continued walking down the street, discussing something, and Celia thought that, as the name of the magical country of Luzon suggests, it was a nation that achieved its greatness thanks to the development of magic. But when it came to magic, no country in the world could compare to Luzon. Countless mages conducted research and developed the country's culture every day. Therefore, Luzon held outstanding mages in special regard, including her. As a member of a privileged class, she studied magic at school. Sometime later, in the classroom, she cast her spell. The teacher looked at her in surprise and said that this was exactly what was expected of her. It was astonishing that at such a young age, she had almost completely mastered blue attribute magic. The teacher called Monica, and Celia reflected that, although she was a little tired of the constant praise from others as someone capable of using magic, she aspired to become a mage, someday to contribute to her homeland. The students looked at her from the side and asked, Is she perfect in every way? At this rate, she would definitely become a mage, as if she were born for it. In that case, shouldn't they conduct an experiment? The maid loudly refused her father and asked what this human experiment even meant. They'd said what would happen to her. Her father replied indifferently that her consent wasn't required. Celia, worried and fearful, asked him, "Is it all for the country?" Her father calmly replied, "No, for the development of magic." He pointed out that she should know this too, as the power of just one mage could change the course of a battle. Her father took a step towards Celia and added that if they increased the number of people who became mages, no one would be able to match them on the battlefield. Celia looked at her father's face with fear as he continued to press her. This is how they will win, even without sending the pride of their nation, the sages, into battle. He grabbed her shoulders with both hands and said loudly, giving her body for the good of the motherland. That's wonderful. She looked at him with fear on her face, thinking that she didn't want to be experimented on. It would be a blessing to stay alive, but every aristocrat in Luzon had heard of high-ranking researchers. Celia remembered Monica telling her she knew a way to escape the country. She donned a black hooded robe and gone out to meet her. She should wait for her in a public place. All she had to do was get there. A servant saw her in the distance and called out, "Monica." Men in black robes emerged from around the corner of the house. The target had been located. Celia, tears in her eyes, asked her why she'd done this. She cried, screamed, and begged her forgiveness. The men in robes grabbed the servant and said, "Target captured. Begin transport to the lab." Celia continued screaming at her friend, asking why she had done this, because she, her best friend, was a devoted best friend. Two robed men led the maid by the arms into the lab. Finally, she was here. Numerous hands reached for her body. "Let's get started." Celia resisted and screamed that she shouldn't have done this, because she was simply living. They placed her on the table and bound her hands and feet, but she continued screaming that she shouldn't have done this. The lab technicians discussed among themselves. It has been 3 days since the serum was applied. Had there been any changes? Her mana levels had temporarily increased, but after a few hours they returned to their previous levels. Another dip in the last 2 days. The servant begged them not to touch her. She was in pain. Due to the constant pain throughout her body, she had lost control of her magic. The scientists discussed changing the direction of their research and starting to lay the foundation for future generations. They could easily train excellent mages, yes, and their superiors were pressuring them, demanding incredible results. Speaking of changes, the test subject's eye had mutated. Celia saw her face reflected in the glass and wondered what had happened to her eye. She said she couldn't stand it anymore. The lab technicians returned to Celia's room, but didn't find her there. A search was underway. They had to catch her before she got too far. The servant ran through the dark forest without looking back. She had nothing. No place to return to. No one she could trust. Even if she escaped this damned country, she had nowhere to go. What would she do? Alan saw a beautiful girl run out of the bushes. He was about to leave when she appeared, and what a sign it was, the beginning of a new story. Celia was kneeling before him, and he looked at her in confusion. The prince asked if she was okay and noted that this situation wasn't conducive to small talk anyway. The maid stared at him with wide eyes, confused as to who he was. The light was too dim for her to see. MC placed his hand on her face and said he knew she'd heard it 100 times before, but she had very beautiful eyes. She covered her mutated eye with a curl of hair. He added that he was sure if she changed her clothes, the bastards pursuing her would lose track. The prince looked at her with a smile, and she wondered, her eyes beautiful? Why was he flattering her? The protagonist replied that he hadn't even tried and asked if she had somewhere to return to. Her family was probably worried. Celia began to sob, and he apologized for the unpleasant question. Alan sat in front of her and tried to calm her down. It was sad when she had no home to return to. He'd seen many like her, and he'd seen those who were longed for but never made it back, which is why he hated war. The prince threw his robe over her and saw people in black robes and carrying torches emerge from the bushes. He noticed that when he saw such people, rage began to boil within him. If she had nowhere to go, she could go with him. If she was in trouble, she could ask him for help. If she asked, he would have a reason to clench his fist. If there was a reason, he would save her. Alan extended his hand and asked her to say it. The maid was afraid to say it. Her heart was beating faster and faster. She couldn't pronounce the word. Her hands were shaking. Her throat ached. If she cast it all aside, she could ask him for salvation. Celia thought she could find happiness and loudly asked him for help. He smiled and agreed, telling her to rely on him. The enemies who had just emerged from the forest sneered at him. To say such a thing, even seeing how many of them there were, was simply an idiot. Alan clenched his hand into a fist. Lightning began to ooze out of it. If they say that they are not idiots, then he is quite satisfied with being an idiot. Alan extended his hand to the side and everything around him began to sparkle. "Well, let's fight idiots," he remarked, noting that she finally had a home to return to. To protect it, he would destroy them in one fell swoop. MC cast a spell, let blue lightning illuminate the hero's path, and instantly all the enemies flew away. Celia watched from the sidelines, mesmerized, unable to believe her eyes. Rise, sitting in the bathhouse with her maid, listened open-mouthed. So that's what connected them to Alan. The servant placed her hand over her eye and remarked that it wasn't exactly direct evidence, but she could somehow conceal it now with magical tools. The first princess, pointing to the eye, said that it would surely surprise anyone unfamiliar with her circumstances. Celia, lowering her head, agreed, and continued the story of how she had fled to the kingdom with her master after that, having nowhere else to go. Roy, seeing Celia, remarked that he was just wondering who to appoint to watch over him. The first prince agreed with his brother and said he would talk to their father about making her Alan's servant, but if she didn't mind, could she help him with her magic? Rise understood that this was precisely why, even after they both became great mages, she hadn't abandoned him. Celia, with a smile on her face, recalled the pleasant moments and added that her home was close to her master, since it had been that way since the day he extended a helping hand to her, who had lost everything. Rise, with a pleasant smile, remarked that it was very romantic. Someone had been watching the camp from the bushes all this time. The protagonist, along with his subordinates, sat near the tent where the princesses were washing. He asked them if everything was ready. The soldiers responded, "Yes, sir." A soldier remarked that their general knew no fear, to which another soldier loudly replied that their general was the bravest man alive. MC saw the princesses and shouted that right now, two beauties were bathing in front of them, one of whom was from the Empire, and if they missed this chance, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. A soldier, worried about being executed, noted that she was a princess of one of the great powers. The protagonist tried to reassure him, saying that she couldn't execute them here, because without them, they would never reach their goal. The assistants shouted with joy and praised the prince. As expected of a commander, he calmly judged everything from the heights of his vile wisdom. They were delighted and excited. Smirnov tried to call out to Alan but noted that it was too late anyway. Their general was finished. The maid stood behind the prince and added, "Is the master really that stupid?" She kicked him in the back with her knee, causing him to fall to the ground. She sat on his back. MC, with a pained expression, thought this position gave him a feeling of déjà vu. The soldiers cheered. The protagonist asked the maid to raise her leg just a little higher, shouting about how good it felt. Someone shouted from the side that he couldn't see a thing. Rise heard the shouts from the street and decided to go out to them. It would be a shame if she missed the most interesting part. Meanwhile, the men in black robes stood behind the camp, discussing how they weren't moving toward the border of the land of magic. Did they plan to cross the no man's land, the empty zone? Another remarked that the road to Lethia was long, and they would still have a chance. The villain noted that, after all, she had managed to find allies in the kingdom, and that the hero wouldn't be so easy to deal with. The robed man reassured his partner and asked him not to worry, as they were already taking measures to solve this problem. Even the hero was just a single mage. A maid, sitting astride the prince, held him by the neck and applied a painful hold. The villain, with a smirk on his face, added that they would kill the princess right before the border of Lethia. The carriage, surrounded by guards, moved toward the border. A month had passed since Princess Rise's escort began. Captain Smirnov announced that the border of Lethia was approaching and everyone should prepare. The soldiers accepted the order and declared, "Yes, sir." The prince, walking beside his servant, remarked that there was very little time left and they would finish this quickly, and everyone would drink a glass of light beer. A few hours earlier, while in the established camp, the prince explained that since then they had no more open attacks. They had managed to thwart the assassination attempt, and thanks to the guards, the night attacks had died down. Alan, holding up two fingers, pointed out that this was precisely why he believed they should split into two groups. The maid, her expression worried, approached the prince and asked why. After all, Lethia was already very close. Wouldn't it be safer to continue moving together? The prince, with a serious expression, replied that it was simple. It was a matter of risk. The soldier standing behind him smiled and noticed the maid hug him. The protagonist clarified that if they were all together, it would be easier for them to defend themselves. But if they could avoid combat, Lady Rise would be even safer. But it was obvious that as soon as they approached the border of Lethia, they would be attacked. The princess responded with concern that if they ambushed her with all their might, the likelihood of her death would indeed increase. She laughed and noted that, after all, the second prince knew their plans. The prince grinned and remarked on their considerable experience in pursuing women. The princess's escort apologized, voice doubtful. Furthermore, if a full-scale battle ensued and they were able to break through their ranks, he wasn't sure their personal guard would be strong enough. The captain glanced at him and agreed with his assumption. He drew a plan on the map and suggested splitting into two groups, one acting as bait and distracting the enemy. Celia grabbed her chin and said that if they were to share their powers, she would stay with the master. MC looked at her, flicked her, and called her stupid. The servant clutched her forehead and told him it hurt. Rise listened to everyone and proposed her own plan, where the logical division would be she, Alan, and her guards, and Celia with their troops. If the servant's face was hidden, she could be passed off as the princess. The protagonist said in denial, no, if it worked out, he wouldn't want to send the princess with her soldiers. If the decoy group included imperial soldiers, the likelihood likelihood of the enemies falling into their trap would be higher. Rise nodded, agreeing with his opinion. Smirnov remarked that he'd like to stay with the commander. The prince looked at him in surprise and asked why. The captain moved closer to the prince and replied that he certainly wouldn't be boring. Alan said loudly, "Don't jinx it," adding that his enormous body made him the perfect target, and since he was so eager to stand out, his place was on stage. Smirnov clicked his tongue in disappointment. Celia lowered her head and said sadly, "They're separating her from her master." He asked why she was so upset. After all, they would meet in Lethia almost immediately. The maid quietly said that she needed to stock up while she could and rushed to embrace the prince. Alan, hugging Celia, ordered the captain to choose those who would go with him. 10 would be enough. The commander looked at him and accepted the order. The MC, with a worried expression, added, "Just in case, as always, if something threatened their lives, they needed to flee, because even if they escaped, their target would still be there, and they shouldn't forget, life is all they had." The soldiers, motivated by his speech, accepted the order. The protagonist walked through the forest, wondering if forcing the princess to climb mountains would result in a note from the Empire. Rise replied that she hadn't grown up in a greenhouse, and he shouldn't worry, but he might only get a note for peeping. Alan glanced at her sarcastically and remarked that this imperial seemed vindictive. Rise asked him, "Are you sure everything is all right with the second group?" He answered her and asked her not to worry. The princess is the protector of the empire. He added that they would certainly deliver her to her destination safe and sound, and the second group only needed to escape the enemy. He noted that they weren't fools either, and if trouble came, they would simply flee. She calmly agreed. The protagonist glanced at her and asked how she was feeling, since not a single one of her guards was here, only 11 unfamiliar wolves. In her place, he would have felt uneasy. The princess lowered her gaze and replied that, unfortunately, she didn't feel comfortable being alone with the Empire's soldiers. Besides, since these soldiers were his subordinates, they were probably kind. Alan smiled and thanked her. She knew how to praise, and they only had to live up to her expectations. Rise smiled and, looking at the soldier, added that she felt even more at ease with such protection. The protagonist spotted a silhouette in the bushes, and she asked what it was. He peered into the darkness and answered, "Aren't those the mage warriors from Luzon?" Rise agreed with his assumption and said the border of the land of magic wasn't far from here, but she wondered what they were doing here. Alan added, "It doesn't look like they just came to the mountains to look." MC looked at them, wondering if another one of their labs was nearby. No, it looked like they were looking for something. Maybe they should leave before things got out of hand. The mages noticed them, and the protagonists turned around to see mages attacking them with staffs in hand. Alan loudly warned them that if they didn't want to be fried until golden brown, they should start kissing the ground right now. Suddenly, a fireball flew out of the bushes. The protagonist shielded the princess and asked why they were attacking them. Rise, terrified, couldn't understand what was happening. It was strange, very strange. No matter how close they were to the land of magic, they were in the empty belt, and they suddenly attacked them. The prince, smiling, suggested, maybe they shot by mistake. He asked them, will they be able to do it again now? Drawing energy into his hand, he remarked that they should focus on clearing the forests elsewhere. There were probably still rabbits here who hadn't managed to escape. He unleashed a powerful stream of energy from his hand at the mages, which froze them. He shouted angrily, "Quick, run! Rise's pursuers are coming this way." Alan grabbed the first princess in his arms, and they quickly raced through the trees. Rise, lying in his arms, added that when she was born a princess, she never dreamed of being carried, but she still wished the situation were a little more romantic. The prince replied that he too didn't want to do that outside of the ballroom. Oh, what difference did it make? Let's go. They ran, and the prince reasoned in his head. For now, they would follow the original route. They needed to get out of the forest and reach the border of Lethia, but the main question was why the mages were attacking them. He continued to reason in his head. Attacking someone thoughtlessly during a four-way standoff wasn't the best idea, since not only those attacked but also anyone else could take advantage of the situation and attack them. He also noted that for this very reason, the chances of falling victim to an indiscriminate attack were extremely low. In other words, they had a target. Mages ran out of the bushes and shouted, "Here they are!" A soldier, preparing to fight off the attack, said, "It turns out there are scum here too." Another soldier rushed to the attack and shouted loudly, "Protect! Prioritize the lives of the general and the princess." Alan, holding the princess in his arms, shouted at them, "Idiots! Don't you dare!" What could they do to the mages? The protagonist cast a spell, let blue lightning illuminate the hero's path, and lightning began to erupt from the ground everywhere. A bright light lit up the sky and blinded the mages. The energy was so powerful that one of the mages burned alive, leaving only a charred body on the ground. MC shouted, "Run! We need to get out of the forest and into a safe zone." The soldiers accepted the order and ran for the exit. Running out of the forest, Alan placed the princess on a hard surface and pointedly told her that Lady Rise hadn't warned them about this. The princess, with a puzzled expression, apologized to him, saying she couldn't have foreseen this. The soldier, looking toward the border, asked the general what to do. Since there were 1,000 imperial soldiers stationed right at the Lethia border, along with 100 mages, waiting for them in battle formation. Alan, confused, asked since when had the Empire united with the Land of Magic. Celia and her army approached the border, but they didn't find any enemies where they were supposed to be waiting. Smirnov agreed with Her Highness and said that he should have gone with them after all. And where were all the enemies? The princess ordered the captain to remain with the group and continue toward the border. He asked her about her. Celia, with a serious expression, replied that she wanted to go to her master. The captain sadly replied that he also wanted to go with her. She replied that if he went with her, who would command the army? The first princess's escort also expressed a desire to go with them. She apologized to them and said that they should stay with Smirnov. The escort lowered his eyes and sadly agreed. Celia said goodbye to them and headed off toward the first group. But he called out loudly after her, asking her to take care of. But before he could finish, she interrupted him and said she was sorry, but that was a decision her master would make. The first princess's brother, Rudin, worriedly asked her if she really intended to leave for Lethia at a time like this. She replied that allies from Lethia certainly wouldn't be a problem right now, would they? Rudin considered her words and said, however, this would certainly anger the second prince's faction. Didn't she fear for her life if the second prince attacked the kingdom again? It would only lead to more senseless casualties. Rise grew angry and loudly declared that they could not allow such a foolish act to happen again, and she would definitely summon their allies from Lethia. Her brother agreed with her and added that he would provide her with reliable soldiers as an escort. He handed her a letter and asked her to deliver it to the kingdom of Ermilla, adding that she must, no matter what, enlist the support of the kingdom's hero. She hadn't heard anything about this. To think that the second prince's faction had formed an alliance with a land of magic would make the kingdom their enemy. She added that Lethia was just a stone's throw from here. And yet, no, what should worry her most right now was that Alan had only agreed to accompany her because she promised him a permanent truce with the Empire. Rise recalled that conversation, thinking that their agreement had been predicated on the first prince ascending to the throne. If that chance disappeared, so would their reasons for helping her. She told them about the ongoing succession dispute within the Empire, though she hadn't mentioned who belonged to which faction. But now they knew that if the second prince allied with the Land of Magic, his chances of ascending to the throne had become much higher. She clutched her robe in her hand and added, in that case, they no longer had any reason to help her. But that was fine. The problem was that the second prince's faction had already launched several attacks with the goal of assassinating her. She continued to ponder what if Alan decided to return to the kingdom and, to ensure a safe retreat, offered her head to the second prince. What should she do? Behind her was a forest swarming with mages, thousands of enemy soldiers ahead. The allied imperial forces had taken a different route, and she was surrounded by 10 kingdom soldiers and a hero. She said she had no regrets, but she had spent her entire life fighting for peace for the Empire, and in the end, she had achieved nothing. With a sad expression, she couldn't accept the fact that they would simply kill her. Even if she had to sell her body, she had to survive. The protagonist angrily grabbed the princess's hand and said, why are you sitting here? Look ahead. They'll figure out later why the second prince and the Land of Magics suddenly united. He continued shouting and said that now they needed to think about how to get out of this situation. Rise looked at him fearfully, unable to understand why. Alan asked her. She thought cutting off her head and selling it to the enemy would benefit the kingdom? He continued to loudly say that even his soldiers could answer this question without thinking. He didn't expect the imperial princess to be so slow-witted. MC angrily said that he would now explain everything to her. He loudly told her that they would simply cut off the heads of all these bastards and stop asking stupid questions. The soldiers stood behind and discussed how harshly the commander was treating her. The first princess fearfully wondered if it would be better for him, since he had no reason to help her in this situation. The protagonist got close to her face and loudly declared that he would not allow someone to be killed who had somewhere to return to. He declared even louder that he would protect her, since how could he turn his back on her now? Rise was touched by these words, tears welling up in her eyes. She called him a fool and said it was more profitable for him to simply kill her here. The prince looked at her in confusion and said that if his brother were here, he probably would have done the same. The commander recalled how his brother had approached him and said he had tried to look for information, but unfortunately, he hadn't been able to find a complete list of the members of each faction. He added that it was unknown who was their friend or foe. He looked at him with a smile and said that he could only make a decision based on the situation, and when the time came, do his best. Alan looked into the princess's eyes and wiped a tear from her cheek. He apologized, saying he was used to acting on his feelings. The soldier called out to the prince and invited him to see something. The soldiers reported that they had observed for a while and hadn't seen any imperial swordsmen or mages anywhere. MC, looking through a telescope, answered them. They really wanted to get rid of Our Lady Rise, but it seems they're limited in resources. MC looked at his troops and said they had a chance. He hugged the princess and loudly asked them, are they so eager to live that they're willing to sell this sweet beauty? The soldiers, smiling, replied, no nonsense. Of course, their motive is to put their own lives first, but they're not so clinging to life that they'd sell a girl for it. All the soldiers shouted, yes. They noted that even if he hadn't ordered it, they would never have done such a thing. The protagonist praised them, saying they were real men. Well said, he's glad they were his subordinates. The soldiers laughed and said, well, how could it be otherwise? Tears don't suit such a beauty. Rise, her eyes wet, thought that they really were all fools. The troops lined up before the commander and awaited orders. The MC began to recite his orders. Well, do everything possible to protect Mrs. Rise from these vile pursuers. He then remarked that, as always, he would go dance with the guys in front. The first princess loudly and with fear in her eyes asked him if he was serious, saying there was a huge army there, including mages. The protagonist turned to her and said, don't be silly, I'm actually a mage, remember? He asked her why he would lose to this gang. The princess tried to speak, but the prince wouldn't let her. He asked her if she really didn't believe in him that much. The princess looked down, clutched her dress in her hands, and said that wasn't the issue. She'd seen his strength clearly, but the prince cut her off and said that even despite this, she was still worried about him. It would be better to just say something to boost his morale. Rise recalled the moment she'd been in the bathhouse with the maid, and she'd said he'd offered her a helping hand without a second's hesitation, even though he'd lost everything. It seemed she now understood how the maid felt at that moment. He was truly a hero. The princess looked at him, smiled, and said that if he returned in one piece, the beauty would kiss him passionately. The prince was delighted and asked what this sudden surge of motivation was about. He was simply stunned by the princess's generous gift. The soldiers were indignant, saying it was unfair. As MC rolled down the hill, he thought that he knew the odds in this battle would be uneven. Even wizards aren't omnipotent. He thought that if they circled him and overwhelmed him, he would be finished. But only if he was alone. The protagonist looked toward the forest, hoping his friend would definitely come. The soldier remaining to guard the princess said he'd found a way to get down from the cliff. He ordered them to carefully survey their surroundings and, if they encountered mages, not to engage in combat, but simply flee. Rise turned, looked at the army, and thought, Alan. The soldier looked at Her Highness and asked her not to worry. If the enemies had sent all their forces here, then Lady Celia's group must have already suspected something was wrong. They were probably rushing here at full speed now. Another guard agreed with his words, and noted how they'd seen her clinging to the general right up until the moment they separated. Lady Rise listened to this exchange with annoyance. Another soldier remarked that it infuriated him. Suddenly they noticed fog rising from the forest. Was that really it? The enemies didn't understand what it was, and the mage replied that it was fog. MC raised his hand and sparks began to fly out. He thought, as expected of his friend. Laughter came from the fog. Sorry to keep you waiting, sir. A stream of electrical energy shot into the sky, and he shouted loudly, shall we fight, freaks? He said loudly and angrily, donkeys who think they can defeat a mage in battle, come forward, don't be shy. MC stepped toward the enemies and told them to approach only if they wanted to die. He would personally escort them from the party to the gates of hell. The protagonist rushed into battle with the knights, loudly declaring, the hero of the kingdom is here. One of the mages noticed his fighters' fear and told them not to be afraid. He might be a hero, but he was only one mage if they attacked in numbers. Before he could finish, another mage interrupted him, saying that the fog was getting thicker. He suggested that everyone gather, because when this work was finished, they would receive ample rewards. Princess Celia was already standing behind him, ready. At that very moment, they suddenly froze, screaming in pain. The villain screamed, besides the hero, there's someone else here, a mage. The maid encased him in ice and asked him to be quiet, as his voice was grating on her ears. She remarked that their voices, no matter how often she heard them, were always disgusting. Celia's magic is blue elemental. She can give the mist she creates physical form or freeze it, turning her body into mist. When she uses her magic, she nullifies enemy attacks. The mages, staffs in hand, stood there, confused as to why their attacks weren't hitting her or where she had disappeared to. He noticed he couldn't see anything because of the mist. Suddenly, the maid's silhouette appeared in the mist behind him. But damn, she'd vanished again. She can appear anywhere there's mist. The mages realized it was best to stay away from the fog. This was the power of the former noblewoman, called a prodigy from the land of Luzon magic, who had become a great mage worthy of standing with the hero. The mages froze and screamed in pain, unable to believe such a thing was possible, already surrounded by fog. This was the magic of Celia Celestine, a water lily that blooms on the battlefield. The protagonist fought the knights, unleashing streams of lightning from his hands and scattering enemies in his path, striking each one with electricity. The quality of the imperial weapon amazed him. He invited his enemies to experience this for themselves and cast a spell. Dark blue and yellow fly like bullets. Instantly, swords soared through the air and headed straight for the enemies. The villain shouted, shoot, fire to kill, no matter what, stop him. The protagonist, dodging the projectiles, approached the enemies. He was out of breath and asked, Do they think they can stop him with this pathetic flame? The enemies surrounded MC, who pointed at himself and replied that the holiest maiden supported him with her fervent cries. Forming lightning from his hand, he declared that he would never stop and cast a spell. Illuminate the hero's path with blue lightning. After which, all the enemies around him were paralyzed by lightning. Celia said with a smile on her face, as expected from a hero, they cannot win. The protagonist struck the enemy with his charged fist and heard a crunch. Alan looked at the maid and said that it hurt, just hurt. Celia looked at his arm and noted that it was the latest technology, pushing durability to the limit, but it had nothing to do with magic, which is why his arm was broken. She added that most of the Empire's armor was imported from the Lazart Federation. MC sat with his hand bandaged and wondered what else he could do. He was the hero. The maid told him she didn't say he had to hit with all his might. The protagonist and the maid heard a voice and turned their heads. It was Rise herself. She approached them and said it seemed like it was over. The soldier standing behind her asked the general if he was okay. Alan smiled and said, "Hey, you did it." The first princess stood and looked at the battlefield, but she still couldn't believe they had actually defeated everyone. MC looked at Rise and asked if she blamed him. She looked at him, unsure of what he was talking about. The protagonist asked her, even if they were their enemies, they were also people from the Empire, right? Didn't she feel anything for those who raised their hands against her? She looked at them all and told him that of course not. Since the struggle for the throne began, she had long since learned to separate feelings. Alan smiled and told her that he understood what a cruel world they were born into. And so did she. He lowered his head and remarked that this was precisely why he hated war. The soldiers standing behind the first princess heard some sounds. They looked through their monocles and informed the general that Lady Rietz's carriage was heading this way with her imperial escort. Celia saw the escort and reported that it looked like they were heading to the border. She had passed this on to her, but apparently they had come for her after all. The first princess stood and simply watched everything that was happening. The protagonist stood up and said with a smile, "Well, hurry on to the Lethian territory, that's it." The princess approached the MC and told him that he could at least pretend to be sad to leave. He replied that he wasn't the type to stage dramatic farewells for foreigners. He looked into the distance and gave a speech. The world was surprisingly small. One way or another, as long as they lived, they would meet again. After all, she was responsible for her country. Rise turned away, about to leave. The protagonist ordered his soldiers to escort her. The princess stopped, returned to the prince, and said she remembered she'd forgotten something. He looked at her and asked what was wrong. Did she really want to admire his handsome face one last time? Princess Rise grabbed his face with both hands and said that wasn't what she meant, that it was nice to see him so confident in his appearance. She kissed him right on the lips and said that they had an agreement. Celia was as shocked by this turn of events as MC himself. Rise called him her sweet hero and said it was her first kiss, so he should be proud. She turned and went to meet her army. The maid, clenching her fists, said that it wasn't worth saving her after all. Alan, with a positive smile on his face, noted that he was personally grateful, or rather, a kiss from a beautiful girl truly touches the soul. Suddenly, soldiers from the side heard the prince's screams. He was trying to calm the angry Celia, as his arm hurt. The first princess's escort group ran up to her and asked if she was injured. She replied no, that Alm and the others had protected her. Suddenly, the escort commander fell to his knees and began to apologize to Lady Rise, as he had been entrusted with her protection by Lord Rudon, but he had been unable to come to her aid in her time of need. If not for the help of Lord Hero, her life would have been lost. The princess interrupted him and asked him to raise his head. She explained that they had only just reached the land of Lethia, and that the real work began only now, until they secured Lethia's support and returned to their homeland. With a smile on her face, she told them that if they were proud soldiers of the Empire, they would see her protection through to the very end. The commander, with tears in his eyes, accepted her order. A few weeks later, the first prince, in his castle, read a letter stating that the others had safely delivered the imperial princess to the land of Lethia. Alice remarked that it would be wonderful if they could now conclude a peace treaty with the Empire. Her brother looked at her with a smile, unable to understand why she was displeased. She loudly and angrily told him that, although they had finally come close to peace, it hadn't increased the money, the treasury wouldn't be replenished, and nothing would change. Roy tried to calm her down, saying there was nothing that could be done. Alice laid her head on the table and said, "If that's the case, all that's left is to find a gold mine." But before she could finish, their assistant interrupted them. He apologized for interrupting their conversation and said he had an urgent report. He had been telling them something for a long time. The first prince was surprised and asked what it was. His sister laughed and suggested her brother fight. Celia sat next to the prince, looking at him confused. Several months after the defensive war with the Empire, the broken arm and rib cage had completely healed, and there were no invitations to war or groups. The protagonist thought happily, then there's only one thing left to do, go to the Dream Mansion. Celia smiled and holding a rope in her hand said she wouldn't let him in. MC was kneeling, tied to a post with stacks of papers on his legs, screaming in pain. The maid came closer and asked the master if she should put another stack on his lap. He told her to stop, as any more and his legs would give out. The maid stood in front of him and said, "Just think, the prince has been talking about resigning since early morning. Couldn't he spend his time a little more wisely?" Like sorting through the accumulated paperwork or planning how to spend the rest of his life with his maid? Alan glared at her and said that her ambition was just too much. He was loudly talking about how the long war was finally over, and it was the maid who wouldn't even let him rest peacefully. The maid casually replied that he hadn't achieved anything in the war, so working was only natural until the Empire's struggle for the throne ended, which only played into their hands. Placing another pack on his lap, she remarked that he shouldn't forget how some fox kissed him. The protagonist loudly replied that it wasn't his fault, even though he'd enjoyed it. She asked him if he could have another one. Screams were heard from the room. Approaching the prince's room, Alice crossed paths with two soldiers in the hallway, then peered into her brother's room. She wished him good morning and waved. Celia, seeing her, wished her good morning, Mrs. Alice, and she wished her back. She remarked that it was very unusual to see her at such a time and asked about her work with internal affairs. The sister smiled and said, by the way, she has something to talk about with her brother. She saw him tied to a post with packs on his lap. She hid behind Celia and said that she didn't think she knew about her brother's hobbies. The protagonist angrily replied that there was no need for such a thing, and it was obvious he hadn't done it of his own free will, that it wasn't a hobby. Alice placed her hands on her hips and asked the maid what the situation was. The maid smiled and said that early in the morning he had very cheerfully decided to go to the house with the girls. The sister looked at him and said, I see. Now everything is clear. She offered to add another pack, to which the maid agreed. MC continued to yell, no. Meanwhile, Smirnov gathered everyone in the courtyard and told everyone to follow the plan. Meanwhile, the maid freed the prince and he lay down on the sofa. Alice, holding a mug of tea, said, by the way, brother. The protagonist, smiling, asked, what's wrong, sister? While sipping tea, she said that lately there have been nothing but wars and the country is having a hard time, you know. Alan asked rudely, it's not his fault, is it? His sister replied that, well, it wasn't exactly his fault, but she'd like to at least complain a little. Their small country was already in dire financial straits. Celia clarified, and on top of that, here before her was a man who'd waged a pointless war and reaped no benefit. His sister agreed with her words. Alan stood up and said he'd fought against his will. After all, the last war had started because he'd listened to the Empire's plea, hadn't it? He acknowledged he'd brought their country to its current financial ruin, but he didn't like being blamed for it all. Alice, sipping her tea, said it like that, but before she could finish, the protagonist asked her why she'd suddenly come. She smiled and said she was going to mend fences with her brother after so long. She stared blankly at her teacup and wondered if, in fact, when her brother finished guarding the princess, their spies had reported back. Alice pointed to a spot on the map and said it looked like they'd found an ore vein in the wastelands between the kingdom and the Federation. Celia, pouring tea, said it was amazing. The prince looked at his sister, lost in thought. She folded her hands in front of her and continued her story, saying she'd consulted with the chancellor. She smiled and told him to go fight. The protagonist glanced at the maid and loudly said, put those stacks of papers on his sister's feet immediately. He shouted loudly about how his sister was so frivolous in sending him to war, but he didn't want to. He shouted so loudly that the captain heard his cries from the street. It was an ordinary sunny day in the city. The prince, his sister, and their maid were walking through the city. MC told his sister that he was against it and would never fight. The princess replied that that was all he kept saying. Celia smiled and suggested they enjoy their long-awaited stroll instead. Alan looked at her and said he'd be happy to, but he was desperately trying to maintain his composure. Alice spotted a stall selling caramel apples and was delighted. She asked the prince for some. He told her she'd have to beg for money from her purse. If she gave him some pocket money, he'd gladly buy her some. Alice looked at him with a smile and said that then Celia would use her painful techniques on him even more intensely. Right? The protagonist replied, that means the victim has already been chosen. They should at least try to make peace. Alice pointed her finger and told him that this was very naive. She said that every time he tried to approach her for sweets, Celia caught him with a strong arm maneuver. It had already become a city landmark. The prince loudly declared it a surreal landmark. Meanwhile, the maid bought apples on a stick. She handed them to her and thanked for waiting. Here are your caramel apples. Alice was surprised and thanked the maid. The maid replied that she had nothing to thank her for and that she should thank the master. The prince looked at them in bewilderment and said, it felt like she paid from his purse without asking, but oh well. They stood outside, Alice eating caramel apples, and the prince, smiling, remarked, and yet it's so lively today. People greeted the heroes with smiles on their faces and offered various services. Someone asked how they were doing. Someone offered them a seat in his establishment. A kebab vendor, holding a skewer in his hand, offered to try it, and he'd already received the money. The man in the hat thanked the maid, saying, thanks to her, everyone's goods have sold out. Alice, holding caramel apples in her hand, said that Roy was also with them today. The protagonist said with a smile, No, he's like an entourage. Celia looked around and noted that this was such a warm country, not at all like a land of magic. MC suggested they all go get something to eat, and the maid was very happy that he saved her and brought her here. Alice, biting an apple off a stick, agreed with them. The prince's sister sat down on the fountain and said that, returning to their conversation, if they wanted to expand the country, there was no problem. They needed to capture the mountains in the neutral zone, attract new artisans from other countries, sell them goods, and develop the kingdom's industry. She noted that if they captured the treasures of the neutral zone first, no one would say a word against them. The prince said cautiously, but if they try to capture it first, the Federation won't remain silent, right? The sister explained it clearly and explained how it would work. Mining is prohibited in the neutral zone, but if another country occupies it, that's a completely different matter. The protagonist, raising his finger, said, so war is inevitable. The maid, looking at the commander, noted, but as Alice says, if this is true, it's a very unpleasant story. The maid offered her prince something to eat, to which he replied that if there was poison in the food, he would be very grateful. The prince's face turned angry, and he loudly asked if he, the prince, would be the one fighting. Alan chuckled and said that as a member of the royal family, he had a say. They just didn't want to be the one pushing the country for its own gain. Alice smiled and told him to try to control himself. The sister, holding an empty apple stick, thought, seeing the maid risking her life to teach her master a lesson, she really wanted to leave this country. She looked at the stick and thought that it still wouldn't convince her. She wouldn't budge while they were discussing it. The Federation might strike first. She thought, watching the maid calm the prince, that the country wouldn't prosper, but it wouldn't be in danger either, since they didn't want to take any risks. What an unpleasant story. Besides, Alice wondered if this was a ploy to prepare for war. She'd already discussed it with the Prime Minister, and after that, she'd leave everything to him. Roy looked at his sister and said, the Ermila Kingdom, thanks to, well, it was able to hold off all the Western countries in the area. His sister looked at him with surprised eyes and said, that's true, but, he added, but can we really rely on him anymore? Alice clutched her dress with a sad expression. Roy apologized to her and said he'd said something tactless. If he were in his place, he would do the same, but someday he'd want to leave, and there was nothing they could do about it. He looked at her and said he couldn't tell him that now. The sister, looking at the empty apple stick, thought that if the royal mouth wasn't standing firmly on its feet, maybe she should consult with Lord Siso again? Celia was surprised by something on the street. The protagonist saw people in white robes, a goddess and a sister from the Holy Kingdom of Ermugand, and to think they'd come to such a small country. Alice smiled and said that they probably came on a mission to increase the number of believers. Maybe she was a saint with them? MC replied that that couldn't be true. The Holy Virgin is second in influence after the Pope. He added that she heals people with a divine gift. They say she's a wonderful woman who saves people from disasters. It's unlikely she has time to accompany a mission to some small country. Alice pointed out that that was true, but as for the arrival, they even welcome him a little. Celia asked, and why not? She added, let's say they don't build a church for the Holy Kingdom here. Then they'll come to the rescue to save the believers if another country attacks the kingdom, right? Alice pointed out that actually, this is Soroy's job. She's delved a little into domestic politics, so she's learned a bit. Alan smiled and patted her head, saying, what a sweet, smug face, sister. Alice laughed. MC remarked that in that case, they could safely let them do their missionary work, especially since the day off would deepen his communication with his sister. Alice happily noted that, as expected from her brother, she loved being around him. Celia grabbed his hand with a sad expression on her face and told him, Master, she is here too. He looked at her and said that his love for her was already at its peak, so she shouldn't worry. She spread her arms wide and was surprised. Oh, really? He replied that it was obvious. The prince, the series, and his sister strolled around the city together, listening to music and sitting in beautiful places. Alice said that next they would go buy souvenirs for Brother Roy. The protagonist said that his brother would definitely be happy and noted that his sister might think about him too. Maybe we should make a stop here. They should have invited Smirnoff along with them. Celia handed the mug to the commander and said, Master, please, here's a drink. She smiled and said that she tried it first, so he was fine. MC took a sip and thanked her. The maid remarked that she wanted to ask something. Alice said loudly that she saw a man in trouble and noted that he needed help. The protagonist said that she could extend this kindness to him too. The maid said that she could communicate freely with her own brother. That is love. Alan added that love was a strong word. Hey sister, who dumped all the baggage on her little brother, be careful. She looked at him in bewilderment and said, Listen brother, it seems the child is lost. A girl in a white robe stood before them, a saint. She said that everything was fine and that she had simply gotten separated from her knights, guards and priests. She added that she had already asked many people, but no one had seen them. Everyone looked at her with confusion. The maid, not understanding, asked, Soldiers of the Holy Kingdom? No? So these are holy knights? Alan asked in confusion. What, the holy knights are here? Stop it. Are they planning to start a war? The girl in the white robe replied no. They had merely come to negotiate with the royal family for permission to build a church in this country. The protagonist's maid watched as his sister's eyes lit up. She grabbed her hand and greeted her, saying, Welcome to the Ermila Kingdom. They would be delighted to receive such an offer. She was overjoyed, ready to eat a whole cake, something she'd never even dreamed of. He tried to calm her down, saying, "Let's just pounce on the cake. You're scaring her with your over-enthusiasm." The girl in the white robe looked at them with wide eyes and said nothing of the sort. "Being energetic is good, a sign of health," the protagonist remarked. "She's like the embodiment of purity and innocence." The maid agreed. He thought it was odd that she was being accompanied by holy knights. Shouldn't someone of higher rank have come? He noted that it was logical, given their hierarchy. The maid added, "Not the Pope himself, of course, but someone of at least bishop rank." The girl looked at them with sad eyes. She placed her hand on her chest and added, "Oh, yes, she forgot to introduce herself. Her name is Sophia Bennett, and in the Holy Kingdom she is honored as a holy virgin." MC thought, the Holy Kingdom and the Holy Virgin, these two seemingly unrelated things, had come together, and at that moment, no one could have imagined that a war would break out between the four powers.